The large room inside the music school was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the type of silence that feels heavy, like the air is pressing down on your shoulders. The floors were made of a shiny material that reflected the bright lights from the ceiling. If you looked down, you could see your own shadow staring back at you. In the middle of this big space stood the piano. It was a grand instrument, black and shiny, looking more like a piece of heavy furniture than a tool for making music. Standing next to the piano was a young girl named Hope. She was very small for her age, and when she stood next to the large piano, she looked even smaller. She was wearing a white blouse that her mother had ironed that morning. It was stiff and scratched against her neck, making her feel uncomfortable. She wore a black skirt that came down to her knees and black shoes that made a tapping sound when she walked. Hope held a stack of papers in her hands. These were her sheet music, the notes she was supposed to play. She was holding them so tightly that her knuckles were turning white, and the corners of the papers were getting bent. Hope was not like the other children who had gone into the room before her. They had walked in with their heads high, smiling at the people sitting in the chairs. They had played fast songs that showed off how quick their fingers could move. Hope was different. She was shy and she was nervous. Her stomach felt like it was tied in a knot. Every time she swallowed, it felt like there was a lump in her throat that wouldn't go away. Sitting in a semicircle in front of the piano were the judges. There were 4 of them. They sat on plush chairs that looked soft, but probably weren't very comfortable to sit on for a long time. They had small tables in front of them with clipboards and pens. They looked tired. It was late in the day, and they had been listening to children play music for hours. One judge, a man with a gray mustache and silver glasses, kept looking at his watch. Another judge, a woman with very short hair, was tapping her pen against her clipboard. Tap, tap, tap. It was a small sound, but in the quiet room, it sounded very loud. Behind the judges, sitting on folding chairs against the wall, were the parents. Some of them looked nervous, biting their lips. Others looked bored, looking at their phones. They were all waiting to see if their child would be picked to go to the next level of the competition. But nobody was looking at Hope. They were just waiting for her to start so she could finish and they could move on to the next person. Standing a few steps away from Hope was her teacher, Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was a tall woman who always stood up straight. She had gray hair pulled back into a tight bun at the back of her head. She wore a dark blue suit jacket and a skirt that matched. She looked very serious. Mrs. Gable had taught piano for 30 years. She knew music very well, but she didn't know much about feelings. She liked music that was perfect. She liked songs that were played exactly the way they were written on the paper. She did not like mistakes. She did not like surprises. Mrs. Gable leaned down toward Hope. She smelled like chalk dust and old flowers. She put a hand on Hope's shoulder. Her hand was heavy and not very warm. "Listen to me," Mrs. Gable whispered, but her voice was sharp. "Do not try to do anything fancy today. The judges are tired. They have heard enough complicated songs that were played badly. They want to hear something clean." Hope nodded her head slightly, but she didn't say anything. She was afraid if she opened her mouth, her voice would shake. "Just play the C major study," Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes looking strictly at Hope. "You know it well. It is just scales. Up and down. It is safe. Do not add any extra trills. Do not try to play it fast. Just make it smooth. If you play something simple and you play it well, they will like that. Do not disappoint me." Hope looked down at the music in her hands. The song Mrs. Gable wanted her to play was there. It was a song called "The Clear Morning." It was a nice song, but it was boring. It didn't make you feel anything. It was just notes going up and down, like climbing a ladder and then climbing back down. Hope knew she could play it. Her fingers knew where to go. She had practiced it every day for 3 weeks. But deep inside, in a place she didn't talk about to anyone, Hope didn't want to play that song. She wanted to play a different song. She wanted to play the song her father used to play. Her father wasn't here anymore. He had gone away a long time ago and never came back. Hope didn't understand all the details, but she knew he was gone. When he was with them, he used to sit at their old piano at home. It was an upright piano, and some of the keys stuck when you pressed them. He would play a song that didn't have a name. It was a slow song, a sad song, but it was beautiful. It sounded like the sun going down behind the mountains. Hope had learned that song by listening. She didn't have the music for it. She just remembered where his fingers went. She would play it at night when the house was dark and her mother was sleeping in the other room. Playing that song made her feel close to him again. It made her feel like he was sitting right next to her on the bench. But Mrs. Gable had said no. Mrs. Gable said it was too emotional. She said it wasn't right for a competition. "Are you listening?" Mrs. Gable asked, squeezing Hope's shoulder a little harder. "Yes, Mrs. Gable," Hope whispered. "I will play this simple song." "Good," Mrs. Gable said, standing up straight again and smoothing out her jacket. "Go ahead. The judges are waiting." Hope took a deep breath. She looked out at the room. The man with the silver glasses sighed loudly and took his watch off his wrist to put it on the table in front of him. The woman with the short hair stopped tapping her pen and looked at Hope with a bored expression. The air in the room felt thick. Hope felt very small. She felt like she was carrying a big stone on her back. She knew she was supposed to be a musician, but today she felt like a machine. She was just supposed to push the buttons and make the sound come out. She wasn't supposed to put herself into the music. She wasn't supposed to show them who she was. She walked slowly toward the piano bench. The black shoes made a soft click on the floor. Click, click, click. It was the only sound in the huge room. She reached the bench and turned around to sit down. The bench was made of leather, and it was cold. She wiggled a little bit to get comfortable. Her feet dangled above the floor because she wasn't tall enough to reach it yet. She had to use the special pedal extenders that looked like wooden blocks. Attached to the pedals, she placed her sheet music on the rack. The black and white notes stared back at her. They were just instructions. They were just dots on lines. They didn't mean anything to her heart. She rested her fingers on the keys. They were white and smooth, made of plastic that looked like ivory. Her hands looked very small against the keyboard. Behind her, Mrs. Gable was watching like a hawk. Hope could feel her eyes burning into her back. If she played the wrong song, she knew Mrs. Gable would be angry. She might even stop her from taking lessons anymore. Her mother had paid a lot of money for these lessons. Hope didn't want to waste that money. She didn't want to make anyone mad. The judge with the silver glasses picked up his pen and looked at his paper. He was ready to mark down mistakes. He was ready for a boring performance. He wanted to go home. Hope sat there for a moment longer. The room was completely still. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady sound. It was the only noise in the world. She looked at the simple music for the summa major study. She saw the notes climbing up the staff. Boring, safe, empty. Then she thought about the song her father played. She thought about the way the melody would drift through the house. She thought about how it made her feel safe and sad at the same time. She looked at her hands. They were shaking a little bit. She took a deep breath and tried to make them stop. She knew what she was supposed to do. She knew what was expected of her. But sometimes the heart has a different plan than the head. She lowered her head, closing her eyes for just a second to listen to the silence, preparing to make a sound that would change everything in the room. The air in the big room felt thick and heavy, like it was holding its breath. Hope sat on the cold leather bench, her feet resting on the wooden blocks that helped her reach the pedals. She was very still. In front of her, the black and white keys of the piano waited. They looked like a silent army standing in rows, ready for her command. To her left, Mrs. Gable stood like a statue. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her eyes were fixed on Hope's back. Mrs. Gable was not a person who showed much kindness, but right now she looked especially strict. She was sending a message without saying a word. Do not mess this up. Hope looked at the music sheet on the stand. It was the song she was supposed to play. The notes were black dots on lines, climbing up and down in a predictable pattern. It was a safe song. It was a song that would not make anyone gasp, but it was also a song that would not make anyone cry. It was just there. But Hope's fingers were itching to move differently. They wanted to go to the left, to the lower notes. They wanted to play the song that lived in her memory, the song that belonged to her father. The judge with the silver glasses looked up from his clipboard. He shifted in his velvet chair, the fabric making a soft, swishing sound. He looked tired of waiting. He had heard so many children play today. He had heard fast songs and loud songs. He just wanted to go home. He looked at Hope and raised one eyebrow as if to say, "Well, are you going to play or not?" The lady judge with the short hair stopped tapping her pen. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. She was looking for a mistake. She was ready to circle something bad on her paper. Hope felt a drop of sweat roll down her back. The white blouse felt even more scratchy now. She took a deep breath, trying to slow down her heart. It was beating so hard that she could feel it thumping against her ribs. Asterisk, thump, 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 asterisk. It was louder than the hum of the air conditioning. She knew that Mrs. Gable was watching every move. If Hope played the wrong song, the first note would give her away. The first note of the clear morning song was a bright, happy note in the middle of the piano. But the song her father played started low. It started deep down in the belly of the instrument. It was a serious note. It was a note that meant business. Hope lifted her hands. They hovered over the keys for a second. She looked at the clear morning music one last time. Then, she closed her eyes for just a blink. When she opened them, she wasn't looking at the safe notes anymore. She was looking at the keys she needed to press to bring back the memory of her father. Her right hand moved. It didn't go to the middle of the piano. It slid down toward the left. Mrs. Gable let out a sharp, quiet gasp of air. She knew immediately what was happening. She uncrossed her arms and took a step forward, her mouth opening to say something. But she didn't speak. She was too late. Hope pressed the key. It was not the bright, happy sound they expected. It was a low, deep, a minor chord. The sound wasn't sharp or cutting. It was warm and full. It filled the entire room instantly. It seemed to bounce off the shiny floor and the high ceiling. The vibration moved through the air and brushed against the skin of the judges. It was a sound that demanded attention. It was a sound that said, "Stop looking at your watches. Listen to me." The judge with the silver glasses froze. His hand was holding his pen, ready to write a number, but he stopped. The sound took him by surprise. It wasn't a clumsy mistake. It was a clear, strong tone. The lady judge stopped leaning forward. She sat back in her chair, her eyes getting a little bit wider. She wasn't bored anymore. She was curious. Hope didn't stop. She let that first chord hang in the air for a long time. She didn't rush to the next note. She let the sound get softer and softer, like an echo fading away in a canyon. She pressed the pedal down with her foot, keeping the sound connected. The silence that followed the note was different than before. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence that was full of waiting. The whole room was holding its breath again. But this time, it was because they wanted to hear what would come next. Mrs. Gable stood still, her mouth slightly open. She looked at the back of Hope's head. Then she looked at the judges. She was terrified. She thought Hope was going to play badly. She thought the girl was going to forget the notes and embarrass herself. Mrs. Gable was a person who loved rules. And right now, the rules were being broken. You don't change the song at the last minute. You don't play what you feel. You play what is written. But as she stood there, she didn't stop Hope. There was something about the sound that made her pause. Hope's hands began to move again. It wasn't fast. It wasn't fancy. Her fingers moved slowly, pressing one key after another. The melody was simple. It was a tune that sounded like a lullaby, but it was sad. It was the kind of song you hear when you were looking out a window at the rain, although there was no rain today. It was a song about missing someone because she wasn't looking at the sheet music. Hope had to look down at her hands. She watched her own fingers press the white keys and then the black keys. They moved with a purpose that was different from her practice. When she practiced the scales, her fingers were robots. They just did the job. But today, they were speaking. Every note was a word. Every chord was a sentence. The acoustics in the hall were perfect for this kind of music. The low notes resonated in the floorboards. The higher notes floated up to the ceiling. The sound was rich and thick, like honey. It wrapped around the people sitting in the chairs. The judges stopped looking at their clipboards entirely. The man with the silver glasses took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. He suddenly looked very tired in a different way. He didn't look like a judge anymore. He looked like a man remembering something from his own past. The music had reached past his job and touched him personally. He put his glasses back on and just listened. The parents, sitting in the back, stopped whispering. The room was so big, and the girl was so small, but the sound was enormous. It was strange to see such a small person making such a big noise. A mother in the back row shifted her baby on her lap. The baby had been fussing, but now the baby was quiet, listening to the slow, steady rhythm. Hope didn't know any of this was happening. In her mind, she wasn't in the music school anymore. She was back in her living room at home. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the carpet. Her father was sitting next to her, smelling like soap and sawdust. He was humming along while he played. She could feel his presence next to her on the bench. It was a feeling so strong that it made her heart ache. But it was a good ache. She played a section of the song where the melody went up high, sounding like a question being asked. Asterisk, why are you gone? When will you come back? Then her left hand answered with a low rumble, grounding the sound, accepting the sadness. Mrs. Gable was still standing near the side of the stage. She had planned to march over and stop the girl if she made a mistake. But now her arms hung loosely at her sides. She was a music teacher, so she knew technically what was happening. The girl wasn't playing the difficult notes. She wasn't showing off her speed. But she was doing something that was much harder. She was playing with perfect dynamics. She was making the piano sing. Mrs. Gable had taught Hope about volume loud and soft, but she had never taught her how to make the music cry. That was something Hope had brought with her on her own. The contrast was strange. The girl looked small and fragile in her stiff white blouse, sitting on a huge bench in a giant cold hall. But the music was warm and strong. It was a paradox that caught everyone off guard. They had expected a child playing a simple exercise. They were getting a soul playing a memory. The song moved into a new part. The rhythm changed slightly. It wasn't a perfect march. It was a little bit loose, like a heartbeat. It felt human. It felt alive. The polished wood of the piano seemed to vibrate with the history of the song. The instrument, which had been silent and cold just minutes before, was now alive and warm under Hope's fingers. The silence of the room had changed completely. Before, the silence was waiting for the performance to end so they could leave. Now, the silence was protecting the music. Nobody wanted to cough. Nobody wanted to shift in their chair. They were afraid that if they made a noise, the magic would break. The little girl would turn back into a nervous student. Hope took another breath. She was about to play the bridge of the song, the part where the feeling was the strongest. Her fingers felt steady now. The shaking was gone. She wasn't worried about the judges anymore. She wasn't worried about Mrs. Gable. She was just playing. She was telling the truth of her heart through the keys. And for the first time all day, the hall was completely, utterly focused on her. She wasn't the shy girl in the corner anymore. She was the center of the universe, and the universe was listening. The music continued to flow, but it changed. It wasn't just the sad, slow sound from the beginning anymore. The notes started to climb up the keyboard, like someone walking up a hill. Hope's right hand moved a little faster now. Her fingers were dancing over the white keys, pressing them firmly, but with a gentle touch. The sound grew louder. It wasn't a noisy, banging loud. It was a strong, confident, loud. It filled the space above everyone's heads. The people in the room were no longer looking at their watches. The man with the silver glasses had completely put down his pen. It was rolling slightly on his clipboard, but he didn't care. He was leaning forward in his chair. For a long time, he had sat there looking for mistakes, looking for wrong notes, looking for reasons to say no. But now, he wasn't looking for errors. He was just listening. His face, which had been tired and bored, was now soft. His mouth was open just a little bit. The music was making him remember things, maybe things from his own childhood, or maybe just a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. The lady judge with the short hair was also changing. She had been very critical, her eyes sharp like a bird looking for a worm. But now her eyes were misty. She stopped tapping her foot. She stopped looking for the technical perfection. She was hearing the story. It's funny how music can do that. It doesn't matter if a note is slightly late or if a rhythm isn't perfect. If the feeling is true, the human heart hears it before the brain checks for mistakes. Hope was in her own world. She didn't see the judges. She didn't see the parents in the back. She was seeing colors. When she played the low notes, she saw dark blue. When she played the high notes, she saw bright yellow and white. She was thinking of the old piano in her living room at home. That piano had been scratched and worn. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them. But her father didn't mind. He would just hit the key a little harder or laugh and wiggle it until it came back up. She remembered the smell of his coat. It smelled like cold wind and peppermint. She remembered how he would put his large hand over her small hand when she was little, helping her press the keys down. "Feel the vibration," he would say. "Don't just make the noise. Feel the music shake in the bones." That is what she was doing now. She wasn't just thinking about the notes. She was feeling the shake of the strings inside the big grand piano. That shake went through her fingers, into her hands, up her arms, and settled right in the middle of her chest. Mrs. Gable was standing perfectly still by the wall. She was a teacher who believed in discipline. She believed in following the rules. But as she watched, something happened that she didn't expect. She saw that Hope was playing with a freedom that Mrs. Gable had never taught her. Mrs. Gable taught her students to be careful. She taught them to be afraid of making mistakes. Hope wasn't afraid. Hope was brave. Mrs. Gable felt a strange pinch in her own chest. She realized that she had never really heard Hope play before. She had only heard Hope practice. Today, she was hearing Hope speak. The song reached a high point. It was a melody that felt like a question asked into the wind. Asterisk, are you there? Can you hear me? Hope hit a high note that was clear and pure. It rang out in the hall like a bell. The sound hung in the air for a long time. Underneath that high note, her left hand was playing low, deep chords that sounded like the earth. It was a beautiful contrast. It made people feel like they were floating and standing on solid ground at the same time. The silence in the room had changed again. Before, the silence was heavy because people were bored. Then, the silence was surprised. Now, the silence was full of respect. It was a quiet that you feel in a church or a library, when everyone is understanding something important together. The air conditioning seemed to hum quieter, as if it didn't want to disturb the girl. There was a young boy sitting near the back, maybe 7 years old. He was there waiting for his own turn to play. He had been bouncing his legs and looking around, bored out of his mind. But when the music started, he stopped moving. He stared at the little girl on the big bench. He didn't know much about music theory. He didn't know what a minor meant. But he knew that the music sounded like a cartoon movie where the hero is sad but keeps going. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, completely captured. Hope's fingers were getting a little bit tired, but she didn't want to stop. The song was taking her on a journey. She played a section that was complicated. It had lots of black keys, sharps, and flats. A normal student would have been scared of this part because if you missed one black key, the whole sound would be wrong. But Hope didn't think about the black keys. She just played what she heard in her head. She didn't miss a single one. Her fingers knew the way because they had learned this song with her heart, not just her eyes. The acoustics of the room were helping her. The polished floor and the high ceiling took the sound and made it richer. The piano seemed to be singing by itself. It was a magical connection. The girl, the bench, the instrument, and the room were all working together. Mrs. Gable uncrossed her arms. She looked at the judges. She saw that the man with the silver glasses had taken off his glasses and was wiping them with a handkerchief. She saw the lady judge with her eyes closed, just listening. Mrs. Gable felt a lump in her own throat. She thought about all the times she had told Hope to play it safe. She thought about all the times she had said, "Don't be emotional," looking at the girl now, Mrs. Gable realized she had been wrong. The emotion wasn't bad. The emotion was the most important part. The perfection was empty without the feeling. She felt a small sense of shame, but also a growing sense of wonder. The music began to slow down. It was like the sun was setting in the story of the song. The notes became longer. There was more space between them. Hope's hands were moving gently, like she was patting a cat to sleep. The loud, strong parts were over. Now it was quiet again. She played a gentle run of notes that trickled down the scale, like water flowing over smooth stones in a stream. It was peaceful. The tension in the room melted away. The judges didn't look like judges anymore. They looked like people who had just taken a deep breath of fresh air. They looked relaxed. The parents in the back had stopped whispering completely. Even the baby was sleeping. The music had wrapped around everyone like a warm blanket. It was amazing that one small girl, sitting on a high bench in a stiff white blouse, could change the mood of so many people without saying a single word. Hope's foot lifted off the pedal just a little bit, making the sound become a bit drier, more distinct. She was getting ready to finish. But she didn't rush the end. She let the song take its time. She played a chord that felt like a goodbye. Then, her left hand played two final, low notes by themselves. Boom, boom. They sounded like a heartbeat slowing down, or a large door closing very softly. She held her hands over the keys, waiting for the perfect moment to lift them. The strings inside the piano were still vibrating. If she lifted her hands now, the sound would cut off too abruptly. She had to wait until the sound faded into the air, till it became a memory. In that moment of waiting, the room was completely silent. But it wasn't the bored silence from the beginning. It was a living silence. It was full of the music that had just been played. The air seemed to shimmer with the echo of the melody. Hope sat there, her head bowed, her small hands hovering over the keys. She wasn't Hope the student anymore. She was a musician. She had shared something that was very private and very special to her, and she had given it as a gift to the people in the hall. And even though she hadn't finished the last note yet, everyone knew that they had heard something they would never forget. The very last vibration of the piano string faded away until it was completely gone. The sound didn't vanish all at once. It seemed to dissolve into the air, disappearing into the high ceiling like smoke. Hope kept her hands hovering over the keys for just a moment longer. She didn't pull them away quickly. She let them rest there, gently, as if she was saying a final goodbye to an old friend. Then, slowly, she lowered her hands into her lap and sat up straight. The room was silent, but this was a completely different kind of silence than when she had started. Before, the silence had been heavy and bored, filled with people waiting for something to happen. Now, the silence was full. It felt like the air was holding on to the music that had just been played. It was thick and electric. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Hope sat on the bench, her legs dangling, her heart beating fast again. She looked down at her black shoes. She was afraid to look up. For a second, the worry came back. She thought, I played the wrong song, Mrs. Gable is going to be angry. I ruined everything. She waited for someone to tell her to get off the stage. She waited for Mrs. Gable to scold her. But nobody said anything. Slowly, Hope lifted her head. She looked at the judges. The man with the silver glasses was not looking at his clipboard. He was not looking at his watch. He was sitting perfectly still, staring at her. His pen had rolled off his clipboard and was lying on the floor, but he didn't notice. He just looked at her with eyes that were wide and soft. He looked like he had just seen a ghost, but a friendly ghost. The lady judge with the short hair wasn't tapping her pen anymore. She had both her hands over her mouth, and her eyes were shining. She wasn't looking for mistakes anymore. She was just feeling the moment. It was as if a spell had been cast over the room. The music had been so real, so honest, that it had broken through the wall that usually exists between a performer and an audience. Hope wasn't just a kid playing a piano anymore. She was a storyteller, and she had told them a story that touched their hearts to her left. Mrs. Gable let out a breath that sounded like a puff of steam. She uncrossed her arms and let them hang by her sides. She looked at Hope, and then she looked at the judges. For years, Mrs. Gable had taught her students that music was about technique. It was about pressing the right keys at the right time. It was about being perfect. But as she stood there, listening to the silence that followed Hope's song, she realized she had forgotten the most important thing. She realized that music is not just about the notes. It is about what happens in the spaces between the notes. It is about the feeling. Seeing the judges react this way, seeing the man with the glasses forget his, Mrs. Gable understood that Hope had done something she could never teach. She had played with her soul. The silence stretched on. It lasted for 10 seconds. Then 20 seconds. It felt like a long time, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a respectful silence. It was the kind of quiet you have when you are watching a beautiful sunset. You don't want to say anything because you don't want to ruin the moment. The people in the back, the parents and the other children, were also quiet. The little boy who had been bored earlier was now sitting on the edge of his chair, his mouth open, staring at the small girl in the white blouse. He had never heard music sound like that. It wasn't boring like his practice scales. It sounded like an adventure. Then the man with the silver glasses moved. He reached up and took off his glasses. He pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped his eyes. Then he did something that very few judges ever do. He closed his clipboard. He didn't write anything down. He didn't need to write a score. He didn't need to count points for finger technique or rhythm. He just put the clipboard down on the table next to him. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. It meant that the music was more important than the score. He looked at the other judges. The lady with the short hair looked at him and nodded slowly. The third judge, a younger man who hadn't said much all day, gave a small smile. They all understood. They had come here expecting to judge a music competition. They had ended up witnessing a moment of truth. Hope looked at Mrs. Gable. She was scared to see her teacher's face. She thought Mrs. Gable would be frowning. But Mrs. Gable wasn't frowning. Her face looked different. She looked softer. The lines around her mouth and eyes seemed to have relaxed. She didn't look angry that Hope had ignored her instructions. She looked proud. She gave Hope a tiny, almost invisible nod. It was a very small movement, just a tilt of the chin, but Hope saw it, and it made her feel warm inside. The atmosphere in the hall had completely shifted. The room that had felt cold and professional earlier now felt warm and human. The shiny floor, the bright lights, the velvet chairs, all of those things didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the connection between the girl, the people listening to her. It is strange how powerful music can be. In just a few minutes, Hope had changed the mood of everyone in the room. She had made the tired judge feel awake. She had made the strict teacher feel soft. She had made the bored children feel interested. She had done all of that without speaking a single word. She just used her fingers and her memory. The man with the silver glasses leaned forward. He didn't pick up his microphone. He didn't need to. His voice was soft, but it carried across the quiet room. Hope, he said. Just her name. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to give a critique. He didn't need to say, good job or nice tempo. He just said her name, and the way he said it sounded like a thank you. Hope felt her face get hot. She blushed, turning a shade of pink that matched the color in her cheeks. She was shy again now that the music was over. She wasn't the brave storyteller anymore. She was just a little girl sitting on a big bench. She realized then that she hadn't disappointed them. She had done the opposite. She had surprised them. They had told her to play something simple. They had told her to play it safe. They wanted her to be like a robot, pressing the buttons and making the correct sounds. But she hadn't done that. She had taken a risk. She had played the song that was in her heart, even though she was scared. And because she was brave enough to do that, she had won something better than a trophy. She had won their respect. The man with the silver glasses looked around at the other judges again. They were all ready. They were all thinking the same thing. They didn't need to talk about it. They didn't need to have a meeting. They knew what they were going to do. In a normal competition, the judges would wait until everyone had played before they made a decision. They would calculate the scores and compare the students. But today was different. Today, the rules didn't seem to matter. The music had broken the rules. The music had made a new path. Hope sat there, feeling the energy of the room. It was a good feeling. It felt like when you were outside on a spring day and the sun comes out from behind a cloud and warms your face. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Her fingers, which had been so busy just a minute ago, were resting quietly in her lap. She looked at the piano one last time. It looked shiny and black again, just an object. But she knew it was more than that. She knew it was a friend. She was ready to get up. She was ready to walk off the stage. But she waited. She waited for the judges to tell her she was done. She waited to see what they would do. The silence was still there, hovering like a friendly spirit, waiting for the next moment to happen. The air was buzzing with the memory of the melody, a beautiful sound that had stunned the hall into stillness. Hope was just a child, but in this moment, she was the most important person in the world to everyone sitting in those chairs. She had shown them that sometimes the most simple things, the things that come from the heart, are the most powerful of all. The man with the silver glasses did something that nobody expected. He didn't pick up his pen to write a number. He didn't speak into the microphone to give a critique. Instead, he placed his hands on the table in front of him and pushed his chair back. The legs of the chair made a scraping sound against the floor, breaking the quiet spell that had held the room. He stood up slowly. He was an older man, and his knees seemed a little stiff, but he stood up straight. He looked at Hope, who was still sitting on the bench with her hands in her lap. Then he smiled. It wasn't a fake smile that teachers use when they are trying to be nice. It was a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and showed his teeth. It was a look of deep respect. He began to clap. It started with just one pair of hands. Clap, clap, clap. It was a slow, steady rhythm. Not loud, but solid. The sound echoed in the high ceiling of the hall. The other judges looked at him, then at each other. The lady with the short hair wiped her eyes one last time and stood up. She began to clap too. The younger man stood up next. Then the fourth judge stood up. Soon, all four judges were on their feet. They were looking at Hope, clapping their hands. It wasn't the polite, quiet clapping that people usually do in a formal hall. It was genuine applause. It was the sound of people saying, "We heard you. We understood you." Hope sat there on the bench, her eyes wide. She didn't know what to do. Her face turned bright red. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She was used to being the quiet girl in the back of the class. She was used to being told to be small and be quiet. Now here she was, the center of the world, with four important adults standing up for her. Then a new sound joined the clapping. It came from the back of the room. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of the folding chairs being hit by hands. The parents were clapping. Then the students were clapping. The little boy who had been bored earlier was clapping the loudest, cheering for her. The sound grew louder and louder. It washed over Hope like a warm wave. It wasn't just noise. It was energy. It was the feeling of the room telling her that she was okay. She squeezed her hands together in her lap, feeling her fingers pressing into each other. She felt a lump in her throat, the kind that comes right before you cry happy tears. She took a deep, shaky breath and swallowed the lump down. She wanted to be brave. She wanted to accept this moment without crying. The man with the silver glasses held up his hand to signal the room to quiet down. It took a long time for the clapping to stop. Everyone wanted to show her that they liked it. Finally, the room grew quiet again, Hope, the man said. His voice was kind and warm, not strict like before. "Thank you," that was all he said. He didn't need to say more. Those two words meant everything. He didn't talk about her technique. He didn't say, "You missed a note in the second bar." He didn't care about that. He cared about the music. He cared about the truth. He looked over at Mrs. Gable and nodded. Then he looked back at Hope. "You can go now," he said gently. "But please don't stop playing." Hope nodded her head. She didn't trust her voice to speak, so she didn't say anything. She just nodded. She slid off the piano bench. Her feet touched the floor, and she felt the vibration of the room in the soles of her shoes. She turned to walk away. As she passed Mrs. Gable, she stopped for a second. She was afraid to look at her teacher. She was still worried that she would be in trouble for not playing the right song. Mrs. Gable didn't scold her. She didn't cross her arms. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on Hope's shoulder. It was a gentle touch this time, not heavy or sharp. She gave Hope's shoulder a soft squeeze. When Hope looked up, she saw that Mrs. Gable's eyes were a little bit shiny too. Her teacher looked different. She looked like a person, not just a teacher. "Good girl," Mrs. Gable whispered. It was simple, but coming from Mrs. Gable, it was the highest praise Hope had ever received. Hope walked across the shiny floor. Her shoes made soft clicking sounds. Click, click, click. The sound seemed to echo the rhythm of the song she had just played. As she walked toward the exit, the people in the rows turned to look at her. They weren't looking down on her. They were smiling at her. Some of them nodded. A mother in the back row gave her a thumbs up. It was a small gesture, but it made Hope stand a little bit taller. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt like she was glowing. She pushed open the door to the hallway. The hallway was dim compared to the bright lights of the stage. The air was cooler here. She walked a few steps away from the door and stopped. She leaned her back against the cool wall and let out a long breath that she felt like she had been holding in for her whole life. She was alone in the hallway. But she didn't feel lonely. She felt peaceful. She thought about her father. She closed her eyes and imagined him standing there in the dim light with her. She could almost hear his voice saying, "That's my girl." She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She knew he would have been proud. She knew he would have understood why she played his song instead of the safe one. Hope looked down at her hands. They were small hands, the hands of a child. But as she looked at them, she realized they had power. They could make people feel things. They could make a room full of strangers stop and listen. They could turn a tired, boring afternoon into something magical. She thought about the judges telling her to play something simple. They wanted easy. They wanted safe. They wanted a robot. But she gave them a human. She gave them her heart. And that was exactly what they needed, even if they didn't know it at first. She pushed herself away from the wall. She stood up straight and smoothed down her scratchy white blouse. She adjusted her skirt. She still had to go find her mother in the waiting area. She still had to go home and practice tomorrow. But something had changed. Walking down the long hallway, Hope felt different. The shadows didn't scare her. The quiet didn't make her nervous. She had a secret now. She knew that being the best isn't about being perfect. It isn't about following the rules all the time. Sometimes it is about being brave enough to show the world who you really are. Sometimes it's the simplest thing, the truest thing, is the most beautiful sound in the world. She walked toward the exit where the afternoon light was streaming in through the glass panels. The light made a rectangle on the floor, and dust motes were dancing in it. Hope walked through the light. She wasn't just a piano student anymore. She was a musician. And she knew that no matter what happened next, no matter how many competitions she won or lost, she would always have that moment. The moment she stunned the hall, not with how fast she could play, but with how much she could feel. She stepped out of the building, leaving the quiet hall behind her, carrying the music in her heart.